Muchas gracias, Miguel Ángel. Y tú eres uno de mis amigos de Valladolid, pero posiblemente conozco a ti menos que conozco Bernal Díaz o Hernando de Soto. Hernando de Pizarro, que ha pasado 24 años en la cárcel de La Mota. Y tú no has pasado 24 años.
No, ya.
Pero en Valladolid sí. You know, I am now so mature that I have been allowed today to be very lazy and to talk in English. If you blame me for that, you must blame Cayetana, who gave me the green light to speak in this barbarous language, which I remember better. I want essentially to compare the two attitudes of Spain and Britain, England, to the idea of Europe. The history on which we build for this comparison is astonishingly similar. And it's this similar history of our two countries on which I wish to begin with to concentrate. If you had expected from me a discussion of European security policy or of Mr. Cameron's proposed referendum on Europe, I must tell you that you have chosen the wrong man to speak. I am a historian, not a politician, nor, despite what Miguel Angel said, am I a political scientist, whatever that may be. It follows that I shall not be able to tell you what our Prime Minister hopes will happen in respect of Britain and Europe in the future. As a matter of fact, it baffles everybody when they discuss that. But it must be worth recalling today that history often gives a dimension which politicians and diplomats, not of course deputies for Valladolid, but what politicians and diplomats often forget to emphasize. Yet the future is always determined by the past. I want to begin at the very beginning, and if you want to sleep, this is the moment. Spain and Britain were both parts of the Roman Empire, of course, both peripheral in one sense, but in a way which greatly influenced us both. You may say that I am stating the obvious, but my impression is that the majority of citizens of our two countries cannot be relied to make any such comparison as that. Spain's role in the Roman world was, of course, more distinguished than the British one, for you gave to the empire at least 3 emperors, and they great ones, Trajan, Hadrian, and Theodosius, not to speak of the philosopher Seneca. I found an agreeable reference to this contribution by Spain to the Roman Empire in a speech, surprisingly, by Bishop Ruiz de la Mota of 1520. He was the preceptor of Carlos V, and he pointed out that before Carlos V, emperors had been offered to the world by Spain on a previous occasion. Well, you were part of that empire, the Roman Empire, from the end of the 3rd century to the 5th century AD, a very long time indeed, longer by far than the duration of the great imperial adventure founded by Ferdinando and Isabel and terminated more or less under Alfonso XIII. Britain can make an effort to claim the Emperor Constantine as one of ours. Was not his mother Helen born in York? But that really is straining things a little, and we can't really compete. Then To return, to continue with this ancient story, the end of the Roman Empire, as we know, was inspired by so-called barbarian invasions in both our countries. You had the Goths, that is the Western Goths or Visigoths, the Vandals, the Suevi, some Franks, and ultimately the Moors, the Arabs from North Africa. We too had a mixed bag of invaders, such as the Angles and the Saxons, the Jutes and the Danes, and then the Normans, which led to an interesting mixture, which that extraordinary European statesman, General de Gaulle, used to mock when he spoke of les Anglo-Saxons, to designate all of us who live north of the Channel, all of us who live north of the Channel, including, rather surprisingly, the citizens of the United States, all mixed with the surviving Roman colonists and the Celts, who supplied most of the populations in both our countries, Britain and Spain, before the Romans came. And then and thereafter, both of us have built our nations essentially on a Roman pavement, a tessellated pavement, perhaps it may seem, but a pavement surely. Both our languages look back to Latin. You in your grammar much more than us, but our vocabulary has been heavily influenced by Latin, especially when it comes to sententious reflections such as I'm making myself now. There are other similarities. If anyone compares Spain of the Trastamarras with England of the late Plantagenets, the differences are quite modest. Both our countries lived through an era of civil war. Both of us were concerned at one time or another with other countries in Europe. The English, as we must call us, for several centuries, to 1066 to 1453, to be precise, had a very long French experience. Spain even had to put up with John of Gaunt, who proclaimed himself King of Spain in Galicia. Both our countries have a literature which owed much in its early stages to Arthurian or other chivalrous romances. Then both countries in the 16th century shared the astonishing achievement of establishing an empire in the Americas. Spain, of course, was the first in this great field, and by 1600 had established a vast colonial world with cathedrals, monasteries, and palaces, which England would not really echo for many generations, if then, and which we as a nation, we, the English as a nation, undervalue greatly. The great religious buildings of the Spanish Empire in the 16th century are, I hope, fully treated in a book which I have just finished, volume 3 of a trilogy which I now have written about the Spanish Empire. Those, really, were your glory days. Instead, England took an exceptional path, which was not one matched by Spain. That is, the drama of a religious revolution inspired by the Protestants and resulting in a ferocious civil war in the 17th century, which was not brought to an end until the end of that century. But it did then end and left us, partly I think as a consequence, with a political system which was more free than any other European country. We then inspired the first industrial revolution in northern England. We experienced our own glory days based on political liberty, eloquence in Parliament, scientific achievement and artistic genius, particularly literary genius, particularly poetry, followed by further imperial concerns, an era which stretched to the end of the terrible Second World War. We had then, for several generations before that, the illusion that our greatness would last forever. But of course, it was an illusion. It would be interesting to spend a time exploring how Spain, as well as Britain, lost their empires and then almost forgot, in the public mind at the moment, almost forgot that we had ever possessed them. There are certain dissimilarities, of course, there. The end of the Spanish Empire was followed by a series of civil wars, beginning with the 3 Carlist wars of the 19th century and ending with the terrible conflict of the 1930s. Fortunately, Britain has not had, at least up till now, a comparable series of murderous clashes at home, apart from those of Northern Ireland. I should sum up this section of my presentation. Britain and Spain have had many experiences in common, such as wars in the Middle Ages, empire in the 16th century, the decline of empires in the 19th and 20th centuries. We have also had differences, such as the Reformation in England and the civil wars of Spain, the participation of England in 2 world wars, which was spared to Spain, and the industrial developments in England. All these things, even those of the 16th century, are responsible for the attitudes of our 2 countries to the new challenge and the opportunities afforded by the European Union now. To this challenge, for reasons reflecting past considerations and preoccupations, we have reacted completely differently. First, for historical reasons, Spain has always, liberals as well as conservatives, seen the idea of Europe, and particularly France, as the route to liberty. Godoy, as well as 19th century liberals, Athania and Negrin, went to France or Britain as exiles. Crossed from Irun to Hendaye, and you were in a just society, people even thought under Primo de Rivera. Most Spanish public men of all kinds have seen Europe, and latterly the European, as the fulfillment of national destiny. Europe has always seemed to offer a liberal embrace. Of course, that may be a delusion. A liberal embrace may also be undesirable sometimes. France has usually offered, as a matter of fact, less liberty than England, but French liberty has always seemed more beguiling in this country and indeed in the countries of Latin America. How different the vision of Europe has generally seemed in Britain. Europe's voiceless tremors do not reach her, wrote the economist Maynard Keynes in his brilliant polemic, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, attacking the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. For England still stands outside Europe. Europe is apart, and England is not of her flesh and body. That statement could probably be said equally truthfully 100 years later. The explanations are several, but not very satisfactory. First, we've only recently retired from the British Empire, and indeed the Commonwealth countries, at whose meetings we're always the chairman, give the impression that we are still in the game of imperial power politics. We rejoice too in the friendship and understandings which we've had since 1917, and since 1941 more particularly with the United States. I'm never quite clear whether that special relationship which we have had since World War II is supposed to be still with us, but the Anglo friendship with America remains a close alliance, cemented by the recollection of a common history, including constitutional history. We've also been led by successive British public people to think of Europe as a place associated not with liberty, as has been the case with Spain, but with tyranny. That is, Louis XIV, Napoleon, the Kaiser, Hitler, and after that, communism. I'm going to spend a little more time discussing the complicated background to our British attitude to the European Community or Union. The accident of history has meant that all preceding international organizations, of which we have been a member, the League of Nations, the United Nations, NATO, of course the Commonwealth, even the Consuls of Europe in the early 19th century, were constructed with Britain playing a part, even a leading part. We are certainly not used to work, as we are now called upon to work, in an organization whose rules we have not helped to draw up. But the designer of the European Union in the first place was the brilliant Frenchman, Jean Monnet, a strong Anglophile as it happens, whose knowledge of European commerce derived from his family's experience marketing brandy, a good basis, you may well think, for planning a new world. Monnet first came to notice when he proposed that complete political union between France and Britain, which Mr. Winston Churchill launched in 1940. What an extraordinary plan it was. The other three European statesmen who played a decisive part in the early construction of our European Union were, of course, all Christian Democrats. Monsieur Robert Schuman, the Alsatian author of the plan to make common use for France and Germany of the coal and steel region of the Ruhr, Dr. Konrad Adenauer, the restorer after 1945 of Germany, and Signor Alcide de Gasperi in Italy. When I was at Cambridge in the early 1950s, I had the privilege of showing Monsieur Schuman round the university. I prepared myself, I thought, very carefully for that visit. I learned the relative gross national products of the Western European countries perfectly. But Mr. Schuman didn't want to talk about commerce. He never mentioned a statistic. He only wanted, as a good Christian Democrat, to talk about Christianity. And I was less ready for that agenda. Now I shall talk about Britain's and Spain's actual involvement in this post-war idea of European collaboration. I hope that movement didn't mean that you think that the time is...
No, it's just a question of image.
I thought you thought the time had come for an interval.
No.
Castro has intervals in his speeches.
Yeah,
no,
no.
In the old days.
Nothing to do with that. Yeah, just image.
Well, now I'm going to talk about Britain and Spain's actual involvement in this post-war idea of European collaboration. The aim, I think, was that the aim of Monsieur Monnet, I think, and his friends, was that by establishing many small-scale layers of collaboration and harmonization of practices, from the size of brandy glasses to the consistency of milk or cream, Europe would one day suddenly wake up to find herself united without having to go through a big formal intergovernmental conference at Versailles or Cologne or anywhere else. Germany and France will become so used to collaboration that the idea of a new war between them would seem unthinkable. Britain was, in fact, invited to join in those early discussions about Europe in the 1950s, and a minister of the Labour government of that time, Kenneth Younger, a friend of mine later, went to see the then foreign minister, a rather rough, good-natured individual called Herbert Morrison, the grandfather, as a matter of fact, of the contemporary politician Lord Mandelson. Younger found Morrison in a good restaurant, the Ivy in Soho, and put the idea of Britain joining in Monnet's scheme. No, no, said Morrison, the Durham miners will not wear it. They said the miners in Durham County, a powerful bloc in the Labour Party, would not put up with it. So a decisive moment in British history was played out in a first-class restaurant. There may be worse things for such things to happen, I dare say. It's odd, though, that the Durham miners should be actors in a drama in a splendid restaurant. Very soon, the success of the coal and steel community, the common market as it came to be known, began to commend itself to policymakers in Britain. They also did so in Spain at the time of the economic transformation carried out by the Opus Dei ministers, the so-called technocrats, of the famous stabilization plan, such as Ullastres, Navarro Rubio, and López Rodó. A door to Europe seemed to be opening in both our countries, but even liberal-minded Spanish ministers, such as Manuel Fraga, couldn't then see a way of enabling the regime of General Franco to enter the common market, even though there were no official political restrictions. Looking back, though, I do think it remarkable that even before 1960, Spain had seen that her destiny must lie within the common market, despite the nationalism of the regime. But of course it was different with the government of Mr. Harold Macmillan in London. I was myself, in the late 50s, briefly, in Her Majesty's Foreign Office, and I remember a series of proposals made in our Economic Relations Department for adapting our economic institutions. One idea was to pursue a free trade area around the edges of the common market, which of course at that time had only 6 members, one of which was tiny Luxembourg. Another idea was the so-called Plan G, which would mean trying to enter the common market there and then, even though we had not been present in the early stages. Mr. Macmillan eventually persuaded his not entirely enthusiastic cabinet in London to support Plan G, and Mr. Edward Heath, the future Prime Minister, became our chief negotiator. It was, however, necessary to be supported by all the countries who were members of the common market if we were to get in, and it speedily became clear that our difficulty derived from France. Mr. Macmillan had known General de Gaulle in Algiers during the war and was optimistic that he could overcome his opposition. But in the end, in January 1963, General de Gaulle vetoed our entry on a fatal move in respect of British-European relations on the grounds that we were still occupied in many activities un peu partout in the world. And the French press insisted that obviously we could not be elected since only one leader in Europe was acceptable. You could not have 2 cocks on the same haystack, one French writer pointed out. No one pointed out that Sparta had 2 kings, and even Rome, in the best days under the Republic, had 2 consuls. I've often wondered why no modern political system has experimented with such a dual leadership. Perhaps Europe is itself an example of that happening sometimes. The next few years after 1963 were complex for Britain in relation to Europe. They were more than complex, of course, in Spain, with the murder of Admiral Carrero Blanco by ETA in 1973, followed by the death of Franco and the successful accession of King Juan Carlos in 1975. But Europe was not yet on the Spanish political agenda, though I do remember being asked to lunch by the Labour Foreign Minister, Jim Callaghan, on the occasion of the first visit to us by a Foreign Minister of the King of Spain, José María de Arelza, who in his admirable speech, he was one of the best orators I ever heard, talked of his desire for Spain to become a member of the European Common Market. Mr. Callaghan said to me, "I'm in favour of the Foreign Minister's plan. So anything you can do in support of that by your writing will be very helpful." I, of course, did what I could. In Britain in those years, we couldn't escape from Europe because both Mr. Heath and Mr. Wilson embarked on a new campaign to overturn the veto of de Gaulle, who by then was dead. Mr. Wilson said he had renegotiated the terms with which Mr. Heath had arranged, but no one quite understood what he was saying, and no one remembers what that renegotiation was. And the consequence was, anyway, that we had Britain's first and only nationwide referendum in 1975 on the subject, an event which effectively destroyed the unity of the Labour Party for a generation. The country voted to remain in the European community by a 2/3 majority. This should surely have settled matters forever, but most of us in this room know that it did not do so. For we have had since 1975 in Britain a most curious experience. I do not myself quite understand how it happened. In 1970 and 1980, all the enthusiasm in English political life for Europe derived from the Conservative Party. Labour was basically against. It's true there were exceptions on both sides of the political spectrum. Thus, a group of moderate Labour politicians, headed by the enlightened Mr. Roy Jenkins, supported Britain in Europe, and on the Conservative side, there were a few clever men, such as the awkward Enoch Powell, who were always critical of a European entanglement. But the leaders of both parties made themselves absolutely clear. This included in those years Margaret Thatcher. She wanted reforms in Europe, but she did not want to leave, though some of her alleged admirers now differ in this matter and think that Margaret Thatcher would have wanted to leave. I think there's no evidence at the time that she did do so. The Conservatives admired the international revival of capitalism, of course. I'm talking about the 70s, which had brought prosperity and riches, as it seemed, to the continent. It had helped West Germany at least to recover from the terrible wounds of war. The Labour Party were critical because they thought the opposite. European politics had revived a capitalism of which they did not wish to partake. The small Liberal Party were always in favour, it's true, but they were not important enough to be counted at that time. But in the 1980s and 1990s, these identities, the pro-Europeans in the Conservative Party, the anti-Europeans of the Labour Party, were overthrown and substituted one for another. Thus, the Conservatives are now basically the anti-Europeans, and the Labour Party the friends of Europe. I cannot think of a similarly sharp reversal of policies in the 3 centuries of British constitutional politics since 1714. As usual, there are exceptions. There still are pro-Europeans in the Conservative Party, such as the dauntless Mr. Kenneth Clarke, and a few anti-Europeans among Labour leaders. But in the main, the two parties have each reversed their positions. The consequence is that in Britain, the Conservative Prime Minister, Mr. Cameron, has undertaken to support a referendum in the year 2017, after he's once again done some renegotiation, and after he has supposedly won an election in 2015. We might be back in 1975, when exactly the same scenario of renegotiation followed by a referendum was assisted on by Mr. Harold Wilson, a renegotiation followed by a referendum, then warmly supported by the opposition party, the Conservatives. But it's improbable, as a matter of fact, that this renegotiation will go very far. I don't think myself the European countries can be expected to go very far out of their way to help Britain in their new desire for changes. I think myself that Mr. Cameron's idea for a referendum may not work. We in Britain are thus embarked on a complex and difficult time in respect of Europe. Opinion is completely divided. Thus, in the coalition government of Mr. Cameron, the Liberal partners are all in favour of Europe, as usual. The Conservatives are divided, with many of the cleverer and most able younger people whom I like and admire, are openly doubtful. Sceptical is the word, if not hostile. Mr. Gove, the able Secretary of State for Education, for example, has said he might be happy if we were to leave Europe. The high-minded Mr. Duncan Smith makes no doubt that he is of the same view. Clever new MPs, such as Mr. Jesse Norman and Dr. Kwasi Kwarteng, who have both written excellent books of history, the first on Edmund Burke, the 18th century statesman, the second about the Empire, have shown that they too are doubtful. The Foreign Secretary, Mr. Haig, seems to share their view. Hardly a day passes without a headline announcing that some important section of opinion believes we need a new deal in Europe or we quit. Historians say the European Union is wrecking lives. The Times reported yesterday only the European was undermining Britain's legal traditions and eroding parliamentary sovereignty. That, as I say, was the Times yesterday. I think Mr. Cameron must now make a serious effort to say clearly and creatively what he wants to revise. He must make not a verbose statement of principles, but he must explain how the changes that he wants can, in detail, benefit all in Europe. For example, the acceptance that criminal law should be reserved to individual nation states. As usual, we have some difficulties with the Labour Party. Their leaders feel that they should not deny the public the right to participate in a referendum in Europe. How can they support such a thing when the Conservatives proposed it? How would they vote, too, is a complex affair. I suspect that most Labour Party members would want to vote in favour. I've come here, really, because we in England badly need your Spanish advice. What are the kind of things which we can ask you in Europe to concede, but which would not drive the European consensus to madness? In these years, of course, Spain has been able to enter Europe successfully after the achievement of your genuine democracy in 1978. This is carried through by the socialist government of Mr. Felipe González in 1985. This political culmination was very cleverly performed, since the French minister, the French Prime Minister, made his opposition to Spanish membership of the European Union all too clear. But what will amaze future generations is there was so little debate. There was a continuous debate in England, but all parties in this country have, I think, assumed that membership of the European Union was certain to be beneficial. We're also now in a new era of difficulty in Europe because of the relative failure of the European currency, the euro, to establish its strength in a gathering of nations which is still essentially a confederation of states, but not a federation. Many have thought and argued that Europe can only be saved, and the euro particularly, as a political enterprise, if Europe takes further steps towards the idea of a further unification of powers and projects. I think myself they're probably right. I myself would prefer that Britain joined in the European adventure, absolutely, the Schengen arrangements on the frontiers as well as the currency, but neither now seems particularly likely, particularly the second. I'm afraid to say that it looks more probable that even if Mr. Cameron carries through his referendum, we should continue to remain our detached, I would have thought, infuriating position, complaining rather than constructing, and rather than use the warm language of Europe. I suspect, though, that in the end, the European Union will find that it will want to create something close to a federal structure. The details need not be intrusive. The word federal means the reverse of intrusive. Each member state will wish to have its own head of state, no doubt, whether it's a monarch or a directly elected president. The settlement will have as a remote ancestor the old Holy Roman Empire, which Napoleon wound up so brutally, which the Congress of Vienna in 1814-15 did not even try to restore. I hope and believe that Britain will remain in Europe, and I still believe that we have contributions to make. Whatever kind of European structure we do achieve, we perhaps need to consider the relation of Europe with the states of the Americas and perhaps Australasia. Israel might be considered too. Perhaps some kind of intellectual archipelago of the free world should be sought. This is an idea which Spain should propose, given her your close relation with the countries of Latin America and across the Atlantic. We need to bear in mind too, I'm about to conclude, we need to bear in mind too that in all our planning and dreaming, that populist anti-European movements, such as in England UKIP, or in France the followers of Madame Le Pen, seem to be increasing in effectiveness. There is there's a continuing argument in favour of British withdrawal, as a letter to the Times from 21 historians yesterday showed. It's interesting to reflect that though Spain has problems with many regions, such as Catalonia and the Basque Country, it does not yet have a nationalist popular movement. How is that innocence to be explained? Perhaps one matter should also trouble us. That is the consequence of independence, and indeed perhaps this would apply to independence in other parts of other countries. The consequence for the relations of the old mother countries with Europe. The idea that Scotland was, or could, effortlessly slide into a new status as an independent state within the European Union needs to be examined as a committee of the House of Lords has recently done. I end here. There's one distinction which Senor Cortes did not mention. I will claim it. I believe I am the only person to have persuaded our Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, to quote from the great French poet Arthur Rimbaud. She did from Rimbaud's famous poem, Le Bateau Ivre. Je regrette l'Europe aux anciens parapets, she intoned. Note that she spoke of anciens parapets. Historians among us should feel pleased at that allusion. Thank you so much.